That distinction mattered more to Jonathan Antoine than people realized. From the outside, it looked like he had vanished. No viral clips every week. No tabloid headlines. No constant television appearances. To many casual viewers, it felt as if the boy with the once-in-a-generation voice had stepped off the stage and disappeared into the wings. But what if disappearing from noise isn't the same as disappearing from purpose? Jonathan didn't retreat because he failed. He stepped back because he survived. And survival had taught him caution. After the whirlwind of Britain's Got Talent, record deals, tours, interviews, and expectations piled far too high for someone who had only recently learned how to exist without fear. Fame hadn't arrived gradually, it had crashed into his life like a tidal wave. Every insecurity he thought he had buried was suddenly amplified under studio lights and public opinion. Was he famous because of his voice, or because of the story attached to it? Would people still listen if the novelty of his origin faded? And who was Jonathan Antoine when he wasn't being introduced by judges, framed by dramatic music, or compared to legends who had lived entirely different lives? These were not questions a 17-year-old is prepared to answer. Yet Jonathan had no choice but to face them. As his solo career gained momentum, another transformation unfolded quietly in the background. He began to lose weight. Not for the cameras, not for approval, but because for the first time, he felt in control of something in his own life. The change was gradual, disciplined, deeply personal. He spoke later about how food had once been armor against pain, a shield built from habit and survival. Letting go of that armor meant confronting memories he had spent years avoiding. Music had always been his refuge. Now it became his mirror. Each performance carried traces of the boy he used to be. The one mocked in school corridors, the one who sang to drown out cruelty, the one who learned early that silence could be safer than speaking. Audiences heard warmth, power, and vulnerability. What they didn't hear was how much effort it took to stand under applause without flinching. And still, he kept going. Jonathan chose a path that puzzled many observers. Instead of chasing mainstream pop success or returning to reality television, he leaned further into classical music. A genre that values longevity over trends, patience over spectacle. Was it a risky move in an age obsessed with virality? Or was it the most honest decision he could make? Classical music doesn't reward shortcuts. It exposes flaws. It demands discipline, humility, and an almost uncomfortable level of self-awareness. For Jonathan, that challenge felt familiar. He had already spent years proving himself, to bullies, to judges, to audiences who underestimated him before hearing a single note. The difference now was choice. He was no longer singing to be accepted. He was singing because he had something to say. Performing alongside legends like Placido Domingo wasn't just a career milestone. It was validation that transcended television narratives. These were artists who understood the cost of a life devoted to voice. The physical strain, the emotional toll, the quiet sacrifices invisible to applause. Standing on those stages, Jonathan wasn't the former talent show contestant. He was a tenor among tenors. And yet, public perception lagged behind reality. To many, he remained frozen in that first audition. The shy teenager who shocked the room and made Simon Cowell apologize. It was a powerful image, but also a limiting one. Growth doesn't always photograph well. Maturity doesn't always trend. So Jonathan learned to live with a strange contradiction. Being deeply respected within his field while remaining overlooked by the wider public. Did that hurt? At times, yes. But did it free him? Absolutely. Away from the relentless cycle of mainstream attention, Jonathan began to build a life that felt sustainable. He spoke more openly about mental health, about the long shadow bullying had cast over his confidence, about how success doesn't automatically erase pain. In interviews, he didn't frame his story as a triumph over adversity. He framed it as an ongoing negotiation, with fear, with expectation, with himself. That honesty resonated quietly, deeply, with people who saw their own struggles reflected in his restraint. Not everyone needs to be loud to be heard. Years passed. Albums were released. Concert halls filled. The voice matured, richer, darker, carrying weight not just in technique but in lived experience. Critics noted how time had deepened his interpretations. The boy who once stunned with raw power now moved audiences with control and nuance. And still, one question followed him like an echo. What if he had won? Would first place have brought greater fame? Almost certainly. Would it have brought greater fulfillment? That was far less clear. Winning Britain's Got Talent might have locked Jonathan into a version of himself he was never meant to remain. The pressure to replicate that initial shock, to constantly relive the moment that made him famous, could have smothered his growth before it fully began. Second place gave him space. Space to fail privately. Space to redefine success. Space to step away when the noise grew too loud. And perhaps most importantly, space to remember why he sang in the first place. Jonathan Antoine's story isn't about losing to a dancing dog. It's about refusing to let a single moment, no matter how magical, define an entire life. It's about the quiet courage of choosing longevity over headlines, integrity over attention, and self-respect over spectacle. So what does fame really mean when it arrives too early, too fast? Is being remembered by millions more valuable than being understood by a few? And how many extraordinary voices are we missing simply because they didn't win? Jonathan never stopped singing. The world just stopped shouting his name. And maybe that's not a tragedy at all. Maybe it's the most honest ending a story like his could have. What happens after the applause fades? It's a question that sounds simple until you try to live the answer. For Jonathan Antoine, the question wasn't philosophical abstraction. It was a living, urgent thing. One that arrived in hospital corridors, in the emptiness of a green room after a standing ovation, in the thin glow of a phone screen at 2 in the morning when the headlines still hummed. The story the public saw, two teenagers on a television stage, faces bright with possibility, voices that seemed too big for their small frames, was only the first act. The second act was quieter. The second act required a different kind of courage. Many people imagine the arc of talent shows as a neat parabola. Discovery, meteoric ascent, fortune, happiness. For some it's true. For many others, the trajectory is jagged and strange. The climb is public, the descent private. For Jonathan, the climb took him to places most can only visit in memory. Sold-out theaters, studio sessions, glossy interviews, the dizzying whirl of travel, but it didn't rewrite the interior landscape he had carried since childhood. Those early imprints, the taunts and the shame, the feeling of being out of step with peers, sat beneath the surface like old seeds. When the lights shone, those seeds didn't disappear, they budded in other ways. He was born and raised in Essex, where flat winter light could make the low, tired rows of houses look like a watercolor washed thin. It's a place where streets know your name and schools know your mistakes. As a boy, Jonathan learned the rules quickly. Silence your vulnerabilities or be made small. He learned that laughter from a group could mean exclusion. He learned to shrink when laughter circled him. Yet in the same breath of life, he tasted something else. Music, as if a secret doorway had opened where the rest of the world was barred. Music was not showmanship at first. It was safety. A note held steady in the chest, a phrase that steadied breath. Singing gave him the scaffolding to put his thoughts in order. Melody braided with memory until anger and shame and longing conspired into something manageable. He practiced alone in summers, voice ricocheting off kitchen tiles, in the warm, forgiving echo of the family living room. His parents, John, steady, measured, a police inspector used to making hard decisions, and Tracy, patient and observant, saw what singing did for him and guarded it like a fragile plant. They took him to lessons, sat through recitals, and kept arguments about grades and schoolrooms separate from the tenderness they offered at home. How does a child learn confidence when the world teaches him shame first? That question haunted the early chapters of Jonathan's life. He learned to listen for the rare sounds that soothed him, and he learned to keep his head down in classrooms that felt like arenas. Corridors became reputational ecosystems where jokes and small cruelties accumulated like dust. Mockery didn't always arrive as a blow. Sometimes it came as a sliver, disguised as offhand remarks about his weight or his mannerisms. Those slivers are quick to infect the tender places in a child's identity. The arrival of Charlotte Giaconelli in his life, his musical counterpart, felt fated in the way only great partnerships do, unforced and inevitable. Two young voices, each with its own timbre, finding harmony by accident and craft. On Britain's Got Talent in 2012, The pairing felt like a revelation. The judges' stunned faces, the audience's rising swell, the instant headlines, these were external validations. But the feeling inside remained complicated. When cameras cut away and the crowd's roar became a memory, Jonathan still carried the old child who flinched at laughter. Their second-place finish was presented as triumph, and in terms of exposure and opportunity, it was. Record deals, tours, and televised appearances followed. Yet with new stages came new pressures, different sorts of scrutiny. Suddenly private flaws were broadcast and analyzed. Every review could feel like a diagnosis of his worth. Praise could be as corrosive as criticism because each public compliment grew its own expectation. What happens when the world celebrates you for a version of yourself that still feels fragile? It's a question that becomes personal and immediate when your vulnerabilities are parsed on social media, when every headline feels calibrated to your nerves. For Jonathan, the celebration rarely felt like healing. Instead, it demanded continuity, proof that the performance was not a fluke, that the voice was not a lucky accident. Continuity, when you have anxiety lodged behind your ribs, is a heavy ask. The emotional unraveling that eventually forced him to step back did not resemble cinematic collapse. It came as a tiredness that didn't wash off, a slow fraying of the edges of his capacity to cope. Depression is stealthy. It doesn't always arrive with dramatic gestures. Often it shows up as not wanting to get out of bed, the sense that noise and light are heavier than before, the slow surrender to exhaustion. And then one day there was a public fracture. The cancellation of a major performance at the Royal Albert Hall. Pause to imagine the weight of that decision. The Royal Albert Hall is not merely a venue, it's a cathedral of performance for many musicians. To withdraw from such a stage is to stake a claim to your private survival over your public biography. For fans and commentators, it was shocking. For Jonathan, it was necessary. How fragile must someone feel to step away from one of the world's most prestigious stages? Not because of talent, but because the mind simply won't cooperate. It's worth staying with that image for a beat. The velvet hush of the hall hours before a show, the empty chairs like teeth, the small stage lights casting innocent halos. Imagine the actor who rehearsed lines for weeks and suddenly finds his script unreadable. Imagine a singer rehearsed for months whose breath won't answer the muscles. The bravest act in that moment can be turning away. Not because the public demands it, but because you want to be alive at the end of the night. Jonathan's withdrawal made a larger truth unavoidable. Achievement does not confer immunity. Fame does not equal health. The world can clothe you in trophies and still not touch what hurts most. The stage can be both sanctuary and executioner. It can provide a place to live out something meaningful while simultaneously intensifying the things you hoped the applause would bury. Around that time, his personal life added another layer of complexity. Young love in the spotlight is often a headline's favorite dish because it pairs intimacy with spectacle. For Jonathan, a relationship that began with intensity slowly turned destabilizing. It was the kind of romantic entanglement where both people meant well but were insufficiently equipped to provide the emotional scaffolding the other needed. When two vulnerable people try to support each other without the tools to do so, pain can ricochet instead of rebound. How often do we mistake emotional chaos for connection, especially when we are already hurting? Intimacy sometimes masquerades as intensity. The late-night confessions, the shared tears, the mutual rescues. But rescues cannot become permanent domiciles. Jonathan learned, slowly and painfully, that being responsible for another's equilibrium is a heavy demand when your own foundations are cracked. The relationship's end didn't look like cinematic closure. It left residue, the small, persistent questions. What did I do wrong? Was I enough? Could I have held on tighter? Even as romantic life churned, family remained a harbor. His parents were more than cheerleaders. They were the people who sat with him during the darkest nights when logic felt less reliable. Their presence, John's practical steadiness and Tracy's emotional attunement, provided a baseline sanity. Charlotte, his sister, was both kin and mirror, someone who had shared the arc of a public adolescence. In private moments, they saw the parts of Jonathan the public never did. There's an old false dichotomy that divides public achievement from private suffering. The truth is messy. The two often coexist. Applause and loneliness can live in the same body, alternating like weather. And when someone chooses to speak about the latter publicly, as Jonathan did, the impact can be profound. He began to speak. Not with slogans or neat soundbites, but with the slow, unembellished language of someone bearing witness to their own life. He talked about depression with an honesty that refused to glamorize pain or to tidy it away. He represented struggle without pretending to have solved it. For many listeners, this was new and necessary. There is courage in public vulnerability, but there is also strategy. Jonathan used his visibility to speak at events and to partner with mental health organizations. He lent his name to campaigns not as someone who had conquered depression, but as someone who lived with it. The distinction matters. Recovery is not a single summit, but an ongoing practice. He also found a new way to tell stories. Children's books became an outlet. Tender, precise, didactic without being preachy. In Jonathan and the Porcupine, he translated his childhood defenses into a parable. A creature who, out of fear, projected spikes and stung those who tried to help. The Porcupine's arcs mirrored his own. An armor that once protected, now kept friendship at bay. The book was a small project, but it did something large. It gave young readers a language for different forms of vulnerability and gave adults a mirror to the patterns they unwittingly teach. Isn't it often the wounded who become the strongest advocates for compassion? There's a strange irony in this. The hurt that once narrowed Jonathan's world later widened it. Because he knew what it felt like to be isolated, he could see the isolated more clearly. Empathy became a skill refined by experience, not a posture. Among the quieter, longer struggles was his relationship with food and body image. For Jonathan, eating had often been a coping mechanism. The thyroid condition he carried made weight management an uphill road. Public scrutiny didn't help. People felt licensed to comment on what he ate, what he looked like, how he should present himself. That kind of commentary can turn any inward habit into public spectacle. But between 2018 and 2019 something shifted. Not a miracle, not a viral transformation, but a deliberate refocusing of habits. Movement that was consistent rather than intense, nutrition that prioritized energy over appearance, and an acceptance that progress would be measured by stamina, not scale. A detail that became emblematic of his new discipline was simple. Walking 10,000 steps every day. On the surface it sounds prosaic. Exercise is exercise. But the ritual mattered. Rain or shine, schedule or no schedule, the step count became a talisman. The walk allowed space to think, to clear the auditory fog of social media and interviews, to attune to the small, sensory details of the city. Walking became a practice ordained as much for mental steadiness as for physical fitness. In April 2022, after many years of not quite answers and misdiagnoses, Jonathan received a diagnosis that reframed his life. Autism spectrum disorder. The diagnosis arrived late in the narrative compared to how some lives are understood. But for those who are labeled later in life, the diagnosis is often a reconfiguration of meaning. Things that once felt like moral failures now read as differences in wiring and perception. Sensory overloads, social exhaustion, the way music acted like a safer language. These were not defects. They were different modes of processing a world designed without that wiring in mind. 2 years later, on Autism Awareness Day, he made the personal public. The reaction was layered. Relief for listeners who saw their own muffled experiences reflected back, and consternation for those who tried to make neat stories from complex realities. For Jonathan, the diagnosis was neither cure nor closure. It was a map. It allowed him to stop pretending his struggles were solely matters of will. It allowed him to ask for accommodations, longer breaks, clearer communication, sensory-aware environments. It allowed him to be less apologetic about needing rest. How many people, especially those born before neurodiversity entered public conversation, lived most of their lives without answers like this? The social cost of late diagnoses is enormous. Misinterpretations of behavior, misplaced shame, friendships that fray because a brain's needs don't match social expectations. Diagnosis doesn't absolve those mistakes, but it can redirect them into understanding. From 2020 onward, the narrow habits that held him together accrued into larger change. Weight loss was visible and noteworthy because it was sustained. People fixated on the numbers. More than 70 pounds, some said, but the numbers were less important than the method. Consistency, not extremes, mattered. He stopped looking for quick fixes. Instead, he built systems that could support a life. Music shifted too. If earlier his singing carried an almost heroic intensity, the kind of vocal pyrotechnics a televised performance rewards, later work felt conversational. The forthcoming album, Speaking to You, was announced with a tenor of intimacy rather than spectacle. The reimagined All of Me recorded by him showed this evolution. The technique remained, but the intent moved from impressing to connecting. It's a small transformation with big effects. A voice that can impress millions with its trained technique can also, when willing, lay itself bare to the peculiarities of phrasing that feel human. What if the real victory isn't applause, but understanding? Many musicians are happiest when their technical gifts are undeniable. Many others find greater satisfaction when their art can hold complexity without needing to impress. For Jonathan, pleasure came from being present in phrasing, in the way breath met lyric, in letting a song lurch into vulnerability. This choice inevitably filtered his audience differently. Not everyone wants to sit through soft edges. Some crave the sensation of being awed. But for him, the trade-off was worthwhile. There were practical results to these changes. Financial stability, slow to arrive for many performers, came from years of consistent work, touring, careful releasing of music, licensing, and prudent planning. He stopped betting his whole identity on moments of virality. Instead, he treated his career like a garden that responds to daily attention. The result, a quieter prosperity built on persistence rather than explosion. Beyond music, his advocacy blossomed from the convictions his life taught him. He campaigned for mental health, spoke about neurodiversity, and returned to anti-bullying initiatives with a posture of lived authority. He did not want to be the poster child for surviving. He wanted to be a companion on the path for others. He learned to accept that his public statements could help someone privately, and that was enough. His authenticity, fragile and earned, made his speaking more credible than polished spokespeople whose words were sourced by PR. In interviews, he became adept at holding two truths together: that he loved music and performing, and that he needed the world to accommodate the way he processed it. He refused to become a voice that set impossible standards. He would not pretend that depression had a single, neat ending. Instead, he described an ongoing practice: medication, therapy, boundaries, and the small, daily acts that form a life. A rumor began to circulate, a documentary in development that would retrace his life not as rise and fall but as adaptation. The idea felt right because it captured what the public had been slow to notice. Careers are not always about climaxes. Sometimes they're about adjustments, about learning to arrange a life that keeps you present. The documentary, if it materialized, promised to follow that thread: careful, slow, and not eager to romanticize trauma. In recent appearances, something signals more clearly than his vocal agility: a kind of peace. It's not a resolution that denies pain. Pain is still present, but an orientation toward it that does not allow it to run the show. He can acknowledge dark chapters without letting them consolidate into identity. He can say, frankly, "I have depression," without needing to attach a triumphal ending. The more subtle transformations are perhaps the most telling. He picks his shows more carefully. He negotiates breaks in contracts so that intense touring schedules do not become triggers. He refuses certain types of engagement that he knows will tax him. In essence, he's learned to be strategic about how his work interfaces with his nervous system. The rituals of his days, walking, vocal exercises, time in the studio, family dinners, are not glamorous. They are durable. There's a small scene that encapsulates this. An early morning when the city is damp and gleaming, the sky still gray, Jonathan walking his usual route, headphones in, always at a steady, unhurried pace. He passes a small bakery and the scent of fresh bread catches him. He smiles, not because the world has become perfect, but because he is present enough to enjoy the smell. The walk is both literal and metaphorical. It's not a path he expects will go anywhere dramatic. It's simply a way he survives another day. What if success is less about the grand gestures and more about the little agreements you keep with yourself? In Jonathan's case, the 10,000 steps, the measured meals, the therapy appointments, the refusal to do shows when it would cost him his center, these are victories. They are the unspectacular but sustainable architecture of a life. He has, predictably, supporters and skeptics. Fans write to say his honesty saved them. Critics argue he should be more entertaining or more industrious. But his steadiness filters the noise. He has learned to hear the signals that matter. Which invitations will nourish him, which will deplete him, which relationships will ask for too much. He is less willing to accept the narrative that success must look a certain way. As the narrative moves toward the present, we find Jonathan deciding to do things differently. Collaborating with songwriters who invite conversation rather than dramatic exhibition, helping produce a new generation of young performers with attention to their psychological safety, lending voice to campaigns that promote neurodiversity in schools. He becomes, in many small ways, a craftsman of possibility. Someone willing to make adjustments to systems so that others don't have to learn the hardest lessons by themselves. The question that began this piece, what happens after the applause fades, remains open-ended. For Jonathan, the answer is not tidy. It's a life of continual adaptation, adjusting touring schedules, pacing recordings, committing to therapy, honoring physical health, and being honest with fans. It's also a life that refuses to be defined by a single public moment. The Britain's Got Talent finals were vital. They altered his life. But they were not the final word. Perhaps the most radical thought his story proposes is this: surviving is not a consolation prize. It's the point. To build a life that allows you to continue, vocally, emotionally, relationally, is an achievement in itself. When the lights go out, the audience leaves, and the stage empties, what remains is a body that must still be housed and fed, a mind that must still be tended, relationships that must still be nurtured. Fame can grant temporary relief from anonymity, but it cannot substitute for the hard work of living well. So what if the narrative we prize, overnight transformation and triumphant endings, has it backwards? What if the enduring, quieter story is the better one? What if resilience is the new triumph? Jonathan did not vanish into obscurity. He reoriented. He chose less visible forms of victory. He chose practices that would keep him present. He learned to recognize his limits and to advocate for them. He became an example not because he performed better, but because he negotiated the practicalities of living with courage and patience. Looking at him now in early 2026, it's easy to imagine two different viewers. One who remains nostalgic for the earlier, incandescent performances, and one who sees the slow geometry of his life and values the endurance. Both responses are valid. Yet the latter has the humility to ask, what does it cost to be visible all the time? How do we make space for creativity that doesn't demand exhaustion? How many more Jonathan-like lives could be eased if the industry learned to value continuity over spectacle? As his new album readies release, as whispers of a documentary circle into something more concrete, and as his advocacy deepens, Jonathan appears less like a cautionary tale and more like a study in ongoing transformation. He is less performative and more present. He is, by most measures, thriving in a way that's durable rather than dazzling. If the question that began this essay persists, what happens after the applause fades? The answer, in his case, is not dramatic. It's a life curated, choices made not for optics but for sustainability. It's a practice of kindness towards self and others. It's the quiet bravery of keeping living when no one is standing, clapping, or even watching. And maybe that's the real story. Maybe the great performances aren't the ones that earn trophies, but the ones that allow someone to keep going when the applause stops. Maybe Jonathan Antoine didn't lose anything at all. Maybe he found the grit to transform the shape of success itself.